Hello, everyone, and welcome to SPE Live. I'm Tom Blasingame. I'm your 2021 SPE President. We're delighted to bring you today's SPE Live Talk, which is on Gaia. Where do we stand? And it's the IEA 2021 Energy Progress Report that we're going to be discussing with one of the principal authors. As always, please share your questions and comments with us on LinkedIn during this broadcast. And to help me with this very important topic, I am absolutely delighted to have two very important, much more VIP than me guests who will be joining me in the virtual studio today. And with that, I'll give a brief intro to my colleague Kamel, who will be the primary. Kamel Ben-Naceur is the president of Nomadia Consulting. He was the chief economist with ADNOC Group in Abu Dhabi, and he has about 35 years of experience in oil and gas industry. Prior to ADNOC, he was Director of Sustainable Energy Policies and Technologies with the IEA, the International Energy Agency. And before that, he had a little stint in government service. He was the Minister of Energy, Industry, and Mines for the government of Tunisia. He also held several positions at Schlumberger, and he was there for a very long time. He was the Chief Economist, Vice President of Technology, Vice President of CO2 Solutions and Services, and he received his degrees from École Polytechnique and École Normale Supérieure. He is one very, very bright fellow. Let me assure you, SPE is in great hands for next year. He is my successor, the 2022 SPE President. So, Kamel, I'm going to hand the microphone over to you now.
Thank you very much, Tom, for the kind introduction. And it's my great pleasure to introduce two very, very talented people, Chris and Tom. Chris, actually, we had the pleasure to work together at the IEA. He joined the IEA in 2015, and he's currently the head of the energy supply unit at the International Energy Agency. He leads the energy supply and the climate analysis within the World Energy Outlook series, which is the authoritative analysis of long-term global energy trends and challenges. Chris holds a PhD in energy and resources from UCL in London, and a bachelor and master degree from Queen's College in Cambridge in theoretical and experimental physics. Dr. Tom Blasingame is a professor at the Department of Petroleum Engineering at the Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. He holds a BS degree, a master, and a PhD from Texas A&M University, all in petroleum engineering. In teaching and research activities, Tom focuses on petrophysics, reservoir engineering, diagnostic, analysis, interpretation of well performance, unconventional resources, and technical mathematics. If I was going to talk about the different awards that Tom had received throughout the industry and academia, it would take the whole session. So from there, I wanted to speak a little bit about Gaia initiative, and I think we have a slide on that. This program today is under the Gaia patronage, and it's actually SPE and APG's sustainability program, which was started back in 2019 with a forum in the beautiful city of Fontainebleau in France, where the HSNE director at that time, Mrs. Joanna Dunlop, convened some very interesting perspectives on where the SPE should be headed in terms of the energy sustainability. And from that, what emerged are general directions for what the industry should do and what SPE and APG should do in that context. It's now called the SPE Gaia Sustainability Program. It encompasses many of the initiatives that we currently have, like the one on the diversity and inclusion, another one on CCUS, and certainly the sustainability technical section. So if you want to find more information, I would suggest that you go to the SPE webpage and get information on the Gaia program, and you will find their presentations and material that would be very interesting for you all. So I will now start with the session on the IEA net zero emissions, and perhaps Chris, as our audience may not be familiar with all the scenarios, I would suggest perhaps you could start reminding us what the STEP scenario and the sustainable development scenarios in which we worked together on a few years ago, what are they, and why did the IEA take on to develop this new scenario, the net zero emission scenario?
Thanks very much, Kamel, and thank you to you all for the opportunity to speak with you. Hopefully, as many of you are aware, we have an annual publication called the World Energy Outlook, in which we always discuss different potential futures for the world and for energy markets. And our aim as part of the World Energy Outlook is to highlight what might be the consequences of actions or inactions, and also to show what needs to happen to reach certain objectives on energy security, on climate, energy access, and so on. And in the past, we've analyzed these through the lens of the stated policy scenario, also known as the STEPS, and the sustainable development scenario, or SDS. So the stated policies scenario aims very much just to hold a mirror up to the plans of today's policymakers. It only takes into account those policies that are in place or have been announced by governments. It doesn't second guess how these plans might change in the future. The sustainable development scenario is based on the same economic and public health outlook, for example, as the STEPS, but it also aims to keep the long-term temperature rise well below 2 degrees centigrade, as set out in the Paris Agreement. And it also looks to achieve other objectives related to clean energy, clean air, energy access. And the aim of this scenario in its totality is to inform policymakers what actions would be necessary to achieve those goals. And if we just bring up the first slide here, we can see that the stated policy scenario and the sustainable development scenario plot very different futures for energy markets and for emissions. We see in the stated policy scenario that there's no large peak in CO2 emissions over the next 30 years. And if this trend continues, we estimate that it would lead to a global temperature rise of around about 2.7 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. In contrast, in the sustainable development scenario, emissions have already peaked. The year 2019 would have been the peak in emissions, and emissions fall steadily to be net zero around about 2070. And this is consistent with around about a 1.6 or 1.7 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century, in line, as I said, with this idea of being well below 2 degrees. But many governments and companies aim to be much more ambitious than this, and they've given themselves the target to reach net zero emissions by the year 2050. And in fact, the number of countries that have pledged to achieve net zero has grown rapidly over the past year. And we estimate there's around about 70% of global emissions today come from countries which have made a net zero pledge. And it's in this context that we were requested by the UK COP presidency to lay out a roadmap for how can the global energy sector reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And this is important because it's consistent with efforts to limit the temperature rise globally to 1.5 degrees centigrade. But as we could see there before, there's a very large gap between the scenarios. Between the STEPS on the one hand and the sustainable development scenario and the net zero scenario on the other, there's this very large gap between the rhetoric and the reality. In particular, one thing we want to highlight is that most pledges are not yet underpinned by near-term policies and measures. And crucially, what our roadmap goes to show is that achieving net zero emissions by 2050 would require all governments to significantly strengthen and successfully implement their energy and climate policies.
Chris, you're probably going to answer this the same kind of context, but I want to step back a little bit and say the net zero emission scenario, it'll lead to a complete transformation of energy demand and supply. You've alluded to this. And to help our viewers understand, again, this is one of three scenarios that IEA has produced, the most ambitious one, of course. What would be the requirements for this scenario to become a reality? You've alluded to it. You've said some things that have to happen, but give us the hard yards about what it's going to take. And I do want to remind everyone that, as Chris mentioned, this is something that the IEA was asked to produce. It is a scenario. So Chris, give us what it's going to take to achieve this scenario, to make it reality.
Thanks, Tom. And it's a very important point. I think we could not emphasize this enough. This is not a forecast of what we think is going to happen. And in fact, one key thing that the roadmap shows is that we're not on track currently to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And if we do want to achieve that, it's going to really require a singular, unwavering focus from everybody, from governments, from businesses, from industries, from investors, from citizens. Everybody needs to play their part. And if we're to achieve net zero by 2050, there's two key things that need to happen this decade. First of all, we need to see the massive deployment of all clean energy and efficiency technologies that are already available in the market today. Things like solar and wind. Deploy these as quickly as we possibly can do. But in addition to this, if we're going to get to net zero emissions, we need more than just the known existing technologies. We estimate that in 2050, around about half of the emission reductions in that year would come from technologies that aren't yet currently available in the market. They're either at the demonstration or the prototype phase. So we know what those technologies are, we just don't yet have them available at scale. And this covers a whole range of different things like electrification of certain sectors, carbon capture, utilization and storage, hydrogen, bioenergy. It spans the full range of energy technologies. So as well as deploying known technologies available, we also need the 2020s to see major innovation efforts to ensure that these technologies are available in time. And if we bring up the second slide here, I'm going to just highlight what we show here is the overall trajectory for emissions in the scenario and some of the key milestones on the road towards net zero. So just to highlight a few of these, some of the most striking ones that we see. First of all, the electricity sector is the first to achieve net zero emissions. And this occurs globally and by around about 2040. And in fact, it occurs earlier than that in a number of economies. And in aggregate, in advanced economies, it is a net zero electricity sector by around about 2035. And renewables become the dominant source of electricity. Today, wind and solar provide around about 10% of electricity generation. By 2030, they provide around about 40%. And by 2050, they provide 70% of global electricity generation. In transport, we also see a real radical shift. So today, around about 5% of passenger cars sold globally are electric. By 2030, this has gone from 5% up to 60%. And in fact, not long after that, by 2035, one of the milestones we can see here is that from 2035, there are no more sales globally anywhere of traditional internal combustion engine cars. Heavy freight trucks are slightly more challenging to decarbonize in the transport sector, but the technologies are improving. And by 2030, more than half of trucks sold globally are electric trucks or fuel cell trucks. Another thing that needs to happen to be on course for net zero is boosting energy efficiency. There's loads of efficiency measures in industry, in buildings, in appliances, in transport. They can all be put into effect and scaled up very, very quickly. And that's what we see happening in our net zero pathway. And as a result of the deployment of all of those efficiency technologies. The rate of energy efficiency, the energy intensity of the global economy, falls by around about 4% every single year to 2030. This is 3 times higher than what we've seen over the past 5 to 10 years. Finally, one of the areas that probably received the most attention when our net zero report came out is a finding that if policies are introduced to be on course for net zero emissions by 2050, this will reduce fossil fuel demand. And if they fall at that rate that we see necessary to be in line with net zero by 2050, we find that there's no new oil and gas fields that are required beyond those that are approved for development. So if projects have been approved but aren't yet producing, they come online in this scenario. But after 2021, there's no more fossil fuel exploration required. There's no new projects that receive FID, and there's no new coal mines or coal mine extensions that are required. Also not required are many of the liquefaction LNG facilities that are currently under construction around the world.
So thank you, Chris. So if you mentioned that the emissions today come in their majority from emerging and developing economies, and which is normal because they need to increase the energy access to their population. They are going through a development, very strong development in some areas. We're seeing countries growing by 2 digits on GDP every year. But as a consequence, and from the net zero emissions, which target zero emissions by 2050, you would need more efforts to come from emerging economies than from development ones. And one would say, okay, but what's the fault of the emerging economies? Because most of the historical emissions have come from developed economies. And those emerging economies need more access. We, as per the IEA, we have about 800 million people without having access to electricity, and perhaps 3 billion people not having access to modern energy sources for simple things like cooking. So what do you envisage as being the mechanism to allow burden sharing between emerging economies and developed economies, so the second one could assist the first one in reducing their emissions?
Thanks, Kamel. It's a really important point, and an element that we really want to emphasize as part of this scenario is that countries don't start in the same place. If we're thinking about the race towards net zero emissions, people don't start at the same place and they don't finish at the same time. You mentioned, for example, that around about 2/3 of emissions today come from emerging market and developing economies, 1/3 from advanced economies. However, in terms of per capita emissions, they're around about 3 times higher in advanced economies. Yet, on average today, around about 8 tons are emitted every single year from people in advanced economies. So what's going to need to happen to be on course for net zero is that advanced economies reach net zero before emerging market and developing economies, and also they need to provide the assistance to get there. And all while this reduction in emissions is happening, we need to ensure that there's economic growth. There will also be population increases, and as you mentioned, we need to make sure that there is universal access to energy. And in the net zero pathway, we have that happening. So you mentioned before the sustainable development scenario. In that, we aim to achieve universal energy access by 2030. And similarly, that's embedded within the net zero pathway. So it's not just about reducing emissions. It's also about ensuring that those 800 million people who don't have access to electricity and those 3 billion people without access to clean cooking get full access to modern and clean energy services. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is we do need an unprecedented level of international cooperation between governments. This isn't just a matter of countries meeting their own net zero goals. They also need to work with other countries in an effective way to make sure that all countries can reach this goal of net zero. One thing that our executive director is always very keen to emphasize is that it doesn't matter if a ton of emissions comes from one city or another city or one country or another country, they all add to the atmosphere and they all add to climate change. So we need to make sure that we reduce emissions everywhere. And one thing we have in the net zero report is that we highlight without international cooperation, it's clear that emissions will not fall to net zero by 2050. We ran a sensitivity case looking at what happens if we don't have cooperation, and net zero is delayed by decades. It's sometime around about 2090. And we should recognize here that achieving net zero emissions is going to be challenging for everybody, but the challenges are probably most tough in lower income countries. We have to make sure that there is technical and financial support to ensure that the mitigation technologies and infrastructure that is needed to reduce emissions can be deployed at the pace and the scale that's necessary. Just recently, since we published our net zero roadmap, we more recently published a look at financing clean energy transitions in emerging market and developing economies. And one number that stuck out from this is that over the past 5 to 10 years, investment in the clean energy in emerging market and developing economies has been around about $150 billion every year. In our net zero pathway, this has to reach $1 trillion by 2030. So going from 150 billion to 1 trillion over the next 8 years. That's obviously a huge challenge, but we should recognize that there's not really a shortage of money. It's just not necessarily finding its way to the countries and the sectors and the projects where it's most needed. So one key thing, or second key thing that needs to happen alongside international cooperation is that governments need to really give international public finance institutions a strong mandate to finance clean energy transitions in the developing world. This includes improving the delivery of climate finance, tackling issues that affect investment risks and returns, to make sure that we can scale up private capital rapidly for these energy technologies. And all of these sorts of factors are needed to foster a pipeline of bankable clean energy projects. One thing that we've seen, unfortunately, is the case quite often in emerging market and developing economies, is that we have one-off clean energy projects. So a private company will go develop a one-off project, and then they will leave. That carries a much bigger investment risk for that company than if there was a real pipeline, a long pipeline of clean energy technologies. If governments can, working together between advanced economies and developing economies, can make sure that we have this pipeline of projects, that will reduce the investment risk for private companies and make sure that we can get the rate of deployment, get that 150 billion up to the 1 trillion that's needed.
Chris, that was a great answer. You really got me thinking about the volume of money that will be required, and it doesn't seem that insurmountable. And especially, like you said, it's there. It's just not being directed to it. To continue on this discussion, the net zero emission scenario, it leads to a significant decrease in oil, obviously, but with natural gas holding, at least in the near term, the next 25 to 30 years. We also see 2 orders of magnitude increase in carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and then a lot more hydrogen. Pick your color. It'd be nice if it was green and blue, but I'm sure some of it, as you indicated, there will be all sorts of boutique industries cropping up, and there will be all different colors of hydrogen there as well. These are going to require skills from oil and gas. We have students in YPs. I was literally just on a call before this about what their opportunities are in this discipline. I did read that portion of the report, the scenario report. It was very good. But can you tell us in simple words, what would NZE do to match their expectations and their needs in terms of a career? So to clarify, if anybody's confused except for me, what I'm asking Chris to do is tell us how would we adapt people in oil and gas to the NZE scenario?
Thanks, Tom. A key element when we're thinking about a transition to net zero pathway is how we can make sure that it is people-centered, that there are not job losses that occur that have kind of structural impacts on communities. But we should recognize that if the world does follow the net zero pathway, there are going to be big changes in the energy workforce. The number that we put together on this is that there's around about 30 million new jobs created in electricity and low carbon fuels, manufacturing electric cars, manufacturing low emissions industrial processes and commodities, and all of these new areas that are going to grow. 30 million new jobs there. But there would be around about 5 million jobs lost in fossil fuels. Half of those are in coal mining, but there are also job losses in the oil and gas sector, particularly in upstream exploration, given that result I mentioned that there is no need for new fields beyond those already approved for development. But as you point out, oil and gas doesn't disappear entirely, and it doesn't disappear overnight. In 2050, in our pathway, there's still around about 25 million barrels per day of oil. It's obviously a lot lower than 100 million barrels we're at today, but it's not nothing. And around about 1,700 billion cubic meters of natural gas, around about half of what we consume today. So making sure that we have that level of fossil fuel production to meet the consumption needs is going to require some investment. And there is ongoing investment into existing oil and gas fields. That's both to make those assets more productive, but it's also to reduce the emissions intensity from those fields. Because the oil and gas that's delivered to consumers absolutely has to be as clean as possible. So this means doing things like minimizing flaring and venting, tackling methane emissions, integrating renewables into existing projects, whether that's for heat or for electricity, whether it's connecting liquefaction LNG facilities to the grid or upstream facilities to the grid. These are all potential areas where we need to see an increase in employment in the oil and gas sector, making sure that oil and gas is as clean as possible. But as you highlight, it's not just about the existing things, it's also about the skills of fossil fuel companies could play a key role in helping to develop at scale a number of the clean energy technologies that will be required in the net zero pathway. So things like hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and biofuels. I mentioned those before, but also things like offshore wind or indeed geothermal. These are areas where the subsurface knowledge, the existing technical and project management expertise of oil and gas companies and people who work in oil and gas companies could play a vital role. Another area is in critical minerals. Because of the surge in wind and solar and batteries, these all require minerals that things like copper and cobalt and lithium and rare earth elements. We see demand for those growing by about a factor of 7 between today and 2050. So again, the mining expertise will be vital to make sure that we have the availability of those minerals when they're required. So really the large-scale engineering and research and development skills and knowledge of the industry can play a key role. And so there certainly are opportunities there. But I think we should be very clear here. The transition to net zero can happen without the oil and gas industry. But we've looked at this in detail and we've shown that it will be more difficult and more expensive than the alternative where we do have the expertise of the oil and gas industry. So this process has started and we are seeing company commitments to reducing emissions or reducing emissions intensities. They're becoming increasingly common. But the industry can and it needs to do more to respond to the needs of reaching net zero emissions to make sure that those companies are well suited to that future which we've set out here.
Very good. And I just noticed the clock that we're at 30 minutes, so I will make these sort of lightning round questions, Chris, if you don't mind, and I'm sure Kamel will follow. There is a cynical view that stopping or greatly reducing oil and gas exploration will affect significantly supply. As you know, we have to find year on year to replace, and I understand there's a scenario that reduces that substantially, but in the short term, there's a lot of concern that we will be looking at significant oscillatory price scenarios. You want to comment on that? I use your words, not mine, but essentially, by saying that you're stopping doing something that is extremely valuable today could cause that to have a unintended consequence of inflating the price significantly for what people are using now. So do you want to give us a quick answer, and then we'll go to Kamel?
Certainly, thanks, Tom. There's a flow of logic to our scenario. We should be clear about this. Governments introduce policies to reduce emissions. We have this surge in clean energy investment, and this leads to a drop in fossil fuel demand.
Right.
And if we have that drop in fossil fuel demand, we find that there's no new oil and gas fields that are required. The logic of the scenario doesn't flow the other way. Reducing supply without reducing demand is, of course, going to lead to price inflation and major security concerns. And in this scenario, we do have a concentration of a smaller oil market in large resource holders. So one number on this, the share of OPEC in the global market goes from 34% last year to 52% in 2050. Right. But we need to make sure that anticipating and mitigating potential impacts on energy supplies, it really is a crucial part of an orderly clean energy transition. If we ignore energy security, it's going to be a longer and more challenging pathway. If we also require this investment into existing fields, and if we don't have that investment, we're going to get a shortfall. So I think that's really the flow of the logic of the scenario is clear. And if we don't have that reduction in demand, then the reduction in supply can't compensate for that.
Excellent. Thank you. And Kamel, over to you.
So, Chris, one argument from the audience, and I'm actually very, very happy when you see the variety of people's origin in the audience. We're seeing hundreds of people from all around the world. So one argument is, okay, today the world is trying to emerge from the worst pandemic that we have ever seen. And there are different priorities and from economic and social, but can we afford to procrastinate and wait for moving to this much more aggressive energy transition scheme?
Tom asked for lightning round answers, and the very short answer to that is no, we can't. The global emissions fell in 2020. I'm not going to give this a slightly longer answer now. Global emissions fell in 2020, but we're already seeing that they're rebounding strongly as economies are starting to emerge from the worst effect of the crisis. And any delay in acting to reverse that trend is going to put net zero by 2050 completely out of reach. I said that 2020 needs to be this decade of rolling out technologies that's in the market, the decade of investing in innovation. And while we have this growing political consensus on reaching net zero, and that's a good thing, the changes required to reach net zero are quite poorly understood. And we're seeing this growing chasm between the rhetoric to achieve net zero and the reality. The pathway that we set out here is just one possible pathway to net zero. It's not the only way that this can happen. And each country is going to have to design its own strategy, taking into account its own circumstances. But what's clear for everybody is we don't have any time to lose.
Okay. Well,
thank you very much, Chris. I think we are running out of time, so I'm going to leave it to you, Tom, to conclude. I want to thank those that actually initiated this Gaia meeting, and especially the Gaia Steering Committee and the SPE technical section on sustainability. Thank you very much for arranging this very interesting webinar. Tom, back to you.
Excellent, Kamel. Thank you for that gentle reminder that we do want to admit that we had a lot of help behind the scenes, and we do appreciate sincerely their contribution, and most of all, the motivation behind this was not to take a position, but to get someone from IEA to explain how these pathways would look. So, Christophe, on behalf of myself, Kamel, and SPE, we really thank you and the IEA for this contribution to SPE Live. We don't have a choice. As an industry, as a society, we have to consider every possible scenario for the future of energy. The consequences are just too great not to. We sincerely thank you for sharing your time and obviously your labor. You are a major author on this, and this is a critical point that needs to be made. You took the time to explain this to our audience. We are trying to build a more adaptable and more sustainable energy future for every person on this planet. And I think everyone involved in this process is sincere and dedicated to that purpose. Really appreciate you bringing out the details in the net zero scenario. It helped me personally. I think it helps SPE to become part of an advocacy for it. And also I want to ask that everyone keep up with their SPE Live on LinkedIn and on other social media, and please be participating in these comments and give us guidance on things you want to see. So use the SPE website, use SPE social media sites. We just really appreciate the opportunity to have you with us. I appreciate Kamel's contributions, that of the Gaia Steering Committee and the Gaia Committee at large. With that, we close this SPE Live event, and we really do look forward to the next one. So thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll talk to you again soon.